just wanted to say this. Ladies and gentlemen, I hitchhiked over half our state just to be here this afternoon. I couldn't get away sooner because no one would pick me up for a few miles out of Billings. So I say when I'm a grassroots Indian, you will believe me. No. Welcome to the Native American Race Relations Healing and Symposium. We, as everyone knows, we had a symposium this morning where we covered a lot of the histories. I mean, would take forever, but we touched base on a lot of the history and just what it is, basically. But with this panel, I hope to make more open discussion, more of the contentious issues facing us, Native people, and this guy right here, Robert Hall, comes from the heart of Blackfoot territory, which is actually, because that's its real name, but only Mississippi can refer to, because that's what it is. Robert grew up in a government housing complex along a cut beat crank.
That too.
Cut Bank Creek. Robert's real name is.
My dorm status.
Well, that's the answer to.
Apaspasi or imideski.
That don't mean houndsy, does it?
Actually, it does. It means Elvis Presley.
Robert works at Blackfoot Community College, which his great uncle Carl Buckles Schilt started up. He teaches the Blackfeet language, which is actually called. He utilizes the methods and from his mentors, William Big Bull, Morning, and
George Price.
George Price. That was the hardest.
I'd even want to put Ginger Collins in there, a speech pathologist.
Oh, okay. And then next is Francis. Francis Bauer, aka Supreme Eagle Chief. He's a student at the University of Montana, as well as a writer and researcher. His main focus in decolonization, settler colonialism, and indigenous nationhood and sovereignty. I think he's the resident young elder at U of M.
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh, it's more. April Upero is a member of the Fort Peck tribes. What's the full name? Assiniboine and.
Yes, Assiniboine and Sioux, the Fort Peck Indian Reservation.
Okay, but her mother would want you to know that she's definitely not Assiniboine. They're no good. She holds an AB in sociology from Harvard College and will receive her GD with honors from the University of Montana in May. After law school, she will join approximately 0.1% of federal district court judges who are American Indian. She looks forward to telling all the men on her panel to be quiet, especially that Sterling. And that's Sterling. Holy what? He's from Blackfeet Res. That's all I know about him. No. He's a fiction writer and essayist, and currently directs the writing center at Blackfeet Community College. Okay, I'm gonna jump right into the contentious issue. This is my background on it, but I'll ask the question first, but then blood quantum. I didn't know it was like a really contentious issue. Because my tribe, we don't go by blood quantum, we go by descendants. But when I started doing journalism, I'd call certain tribes up, and that was their tribes were like literally split politically on those lines sometimes. Especially Browning, they always had to throw in jibes against, those descendants, those other guys, blood quantum people. It was always a divide. But anyways, these guys are from Browning, and so that was my introduction to a lot of people from Browning. They always talk about blood quantum, whether it was applicable or not. But anyways, explain what blood quantum is and how you believe it hinders sovereignty. Who wants to explain blood quantum in layman terms?
Yes, I will. First, I think I speak for the entire panel. And no, it all matters in one. That we just acknowledge that we're on traditional Salish land right now. And as blood quantum, so I think everybody's probably familiar with Nazi Germany. Is that fair to say? They had a policy of, I guess, labeling Jews for their blood membership and documenting them through their process to extermination. Anyway, the U.S. has a very similar policy, and I believe the Nazis actually took theirs from the American government to quantify Indian blood as a means to, I guess they said, to ration things and so they could document them on their reservations. That's what we've always been told. And that's what I grew up hearing, right? Is that we got it. We have these cards and we have half blood and quarter blood, eighth blood, and all these things so that we know who gets the money and who doesn't, who gets the resources and how much. But I think, as far as I've ever seen it, it's been used as a tool to erase a good majority of people from the rolls or from the Indian tribe itself. So, for instance, my dad is on the tribal council. He's a full member. Myself, I'm considered an associate member because I have an eighth blood that's documented. And then my son, he's not enrolled at all. So he's, I guess a non-Indian or an undocumented Indian. I don't know exactly how that would be. Basically, he's not a person anyway. That's the gist of blood quantum. So we're completely subject to federal law and tribal law on any reservation, but we're not allowed to vote or take part in the democratic processes of those reservations.
But if I want to murder you, which I do,
Yeah.
and I do that on a reservation, I will be tried
As an
as
Indian.
an Indian, even though I have no right to vote on the reservation where I'm from.
So basically, you get all the bullshit that comes with being an Indian, but you don't get any of the treaty rights. And that's I know, and I say that kind of in a, in a strong statement, but that's because this is a heavy thing, and it goes back to colonization. Obviously, we all know that. And you look at the way that institutional America treated people of color. You had the one drop rule on one end, one spectrum for African Americans. And the reason why you had this one drop rule is because these people were unaware or unable to have the the advancements and the progress and the be treated as full citizens under the colonial power. So you wanted that population to expand as easily as possible. So one drop of blood, well, we don't have to give you resources because you're black. But then on this other spectrum, on the other side, you have the indigenous people who have sovereign rights and legal rights and treaty rights for this land. So you want to try to diminish those people as possible. So you make it harder to be an Indian and make it easier to be, a person of color. And it's really interesting too, because one thing I want to also mention too is that idea of blood quantum is really arbitrary for a couple things. Number one, genetics does not work the way that blood quantum works. So blood quantum is a very horrible example of one's actual genetics. Genetics, it doesn't work that way. Science does not work that way. It's colonial, it's fiction. We're basically arguing Harry Potter themes, seriously. Oh, you're a mudblood and stuff like that. And then also with that too is that we're, what it's doing is you're taking a group of people and, a culture, a sovereign culture, and you're turning them into an American race. And Indians themselves are falling for this rhetoric. Well, I'm an Indian. It's like, no, you're not. You're not an Indian. There's no such thing as Indian because Indian. That word Indian does not exist in our language. You're matapi, you're a human. Race is really, we have to really examine language's relationship to racial thinking as well. But anyways, what I'm trying to get to is it goes even back to the sovereign issue where if the Blackfoot are Indians, and the Cherokee are Indians. You know, the policies that they created to affect the Cherokee Indians affects all Indians. And it's really weird that America and Indians just accept this rhetoric. And it's really stupid because we don't speak about European nations as, oh, the French Caucasian nation. Oh, the Chinese, the Chinese Oriental. And that sounds really like, oh, what? Did you say Oriental? You know, I'm serious though. But it's like, oh, it's okay to call me an Indian though, even though I'm not. And that's another thing about blood quantum. It's like when you fight for blood quantum, people who are colonized, you have to have empathy for them first of all, because they've been colonized, so they've been abused, so they're against opening the rolls. So what they'll do is, like, well, you're not an Indian, and it's like, well, I'm not trying to be an Indian, I'm Bikani. And it's really weird that now too, with blood quantum, again, race is fiction, it doesn't work, so it's an arbitrary system. And then a lot of people are now arguing, well, what about total Indian blood? And for me, I'm like, well, what does being Crow have to do with being Blackfoot? I mean, if I have German blood, does that give me an excuse to go, oh, well, I'm Czech, because I got German blood, This idea of racial thinking is damaging our sovereignty to the extent that we look at our sovereignty as this racial situation when it's not. And really what it is too is just as long as the idea of race persists in Indian country, we remain colonized, and we will not decolonize ourselves. We can act like it, but I'm not an Indian. You guys are not Indians, except for this guy. But
Indian.
he's an Indian. No, but I mean, like that rhetoric is important because the language we choose to describe ourselves is critical. And if we decide and we agree with the colonizing force that, okay, we're an Indian, then the colonizing force is going to, okay, that benefits us, that works for us. Because we're going to pass this act against these Indians, and you guys are Indians too. But again, I just want to point out the inherent stupidity that, in America, are there any African American reservations? Are there any Asian reservations? So why in the piss do we have to say the Indian reservation? It's really weird. Are there white people reservations? Why is it that in our official word for the land that we retained, why did it get racialized? Why did our land get racialized? Think about that. Except for you, don't think about it.
My head.
It's important to tie blood quantum to the land, to land loss, during the allotment era, federal Indian policy in the 1950s described as this great pulverizing force to break up the tribal mass. Parcels of land were granted in a restricted sort of fee status to individual Indian men with this idea that those would pass into a sort of fee title. So they would have clear title, not under the stewardship of the federal government. After 25 years or after a certain period of time based on individual tribal statutes, or based on a determination of competency. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that one of the factors in determining an Indian competent was blood quantum, was this idea that if you're less Indian, you might somehow be more competent to manage your affairs in the quote-unquote white world. So despite the sort of rhetoric of record keeping and knowing who's who that I think we've all heard and that Francis cited too, in addition to erasing people now, this is long had an insidious purpose in federal Indian policy.
Yeah, and then on the opposite spectrum too, nowadays you get the hardcore Indian bunch where they believe that their full-bloodedness gives them access to Indian knowledge far better than people who are, mudbloods. Well, that's the thing though, I want you guys to understand there is no such thing as a full blood or a half blood, because it's all like every single one of us has hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's it brings oxygen to your muscles. It doesn't bring knowledge to your brain. And that's the thing, is that every single one of us in here are full bloods. It's not like we have orange juice or apple juice in our veins. And it's just the rhetoric that goes unchecked, because for hundreds of years we go, okay, yeah, it works, but it doesn't. Logically, it falls apart. And really quick, I'll shut up, I promise. But there's this paradox called the Sorite's paradox, and obviously it comes from the Greek culture. But really, like, what makes a heap of sand? How many grains of sand make a heap? So if I put a heap of sand right here and start taking out one sand particle at a time, at what point is that no longer a heap, right? So arbitrary that is. But instead, in Indian country, we've decided, oh, 1/4 Indian, you're no longer Indian. It's just an arbitrary designation that means nothing. And here's another thing. I'm actually kind of an anomaly as a non-enrolled member because both of my parents are enrolled Blackfeet, and I'm not. That's the nature of blood quantum, to erase identity, erase sovereign citizenship. It's designed like this. I'm the Indian that George Washington, Donald Trump wants. Okay? If I get in trouble, I'm an Indian. But if I succeed, I don't get. I'm not an Indian. It's really interesting. It's a paradox. If you're an Indian, you are a paradox.
I think.
Oh, good.
I think it's important to recognize too that one of the things that because we've been I mean, when I say we, I mean like tribal people generally in North America, because we've been in a colonial situation for so long. There are certain concepts that are basic. There are certain concepts that were developed by the colonizer, in this case the United States, that have been here for so long that they're actually just built generally into American consciousness. And so there are certain things that they're like this one of these things, this topic of Indian blood. This idea has been around for so long that Americans don't even think about what they're saying when they actually say, well, how much Indian are you? That's been a question that's been around for centuries now. And and so it's in a lot of ways, to me, it's akin to the situation. It's like it's the analogy of the fish in water. The fish are always in water, and so they don't, if you ask them like, well, what is it like to, breathe water? They have no idea what you're talking about because it's the only thing they've ever known. So when you start talking about blood quantum, you're dealing with a situation like that, where not only Americans, but at this point in time also, and just to tell you how fast this stuff happens, the Blackfeet tribe adopted the current blood quantum criteria in 1962, and so prior to this, I mean, it's crazy how fast this stuff happens and how fast it becomes part of the way people think without even thinking about how they're thinking, right? So in 1962, which is what?
55 years.
See, I'm bad with numbers. Thank you very much. So in the span of 55 years, which is basically 2/3 of an average person's life, the Blackfeet tribe people have gone from thinking about themselves in terms that have nothing to do with blood quantum to almost completely thinking about themselves in terms of blood quantum. Like, think about that, 55 years, and now almost everybody at home thinks about themselves in terms of, well, how much Blackfeet am I, right? And but if you go talk to elders who are fluent speakers, they don't think this way. And this is one of the reasons that I think that language revitalization is so unbelievably important to the project of decolonization, because when you actually have exposure to elders like this, they don't think of, in fact, it was one of the most interesting, looking back on it, one of the most interesting experiences of my life was being treated by, because I'm not enrolled either, was being treated by certain people who were younger as though I was or was not Indian, according to how they felt either about my blood quantum or the color of my skin.
It was just your face.
And it was mostly my face. And then, but at the same, simultaneously having exposure to elders who didn't treat me that way at all. And eventually I started to figure out a lot of that had to do with because these elders actually, their first language was Nitsipo. And so they actually thought, there is no concept in our language for blood quantum. There is no concept for blood inheritance in a fractionated manner in our language. It does not exist. We asked the fluent speaker that Robert and I worked with, we asked him, it said well, how do you talk about blood quantum in our language? And he had to think about it for a while, and he basically invented a term, because there isn't one. And he translated it as the government is watching your blood. So think about that for a minute. So internally, to somebody like him, who's a first language speaker, the only way to conceive of this idea of blood is to think about it the way that the colonizer is thinking about it, because it's not an internal concept. So when we have to understand when we're talking about blood quantum, what we're doing is we're playing a game that there is no way for us to win. It's not possible. This game was set up for us to lose from the very beginning. And I'll just say this and then I don't know, I'll stop. But the thing that I've never, so when I was going to school here a couple years ago, and I was doing research for a paper on blood quantum, and I was just trying to research the history of blood quantum, because the thing is like you hear a lot of indigenous people in the United States talk about blood and blood quantum, but nobody ever addresses like, well, where does this idea of blood come from? Like the whole idea of 1/4 blood, that was actually something, 1/4 blood, that's always in quotes when I say it, because it doesn't exist. Unless you've been inbreeding, like maybe you've been inbreeding for a long time, and then you have some sense of like a purity of blood, right? Which is
Targaryen.
the Targaryens, right? So like, what's interesting is that when you start going back and you start researching this idea of blood quantum, you realize very quickly, okay, it was brought over here by European colonizers. They actually had this concept before they arrived on the shores of this continent. They brought it over with them, and they use it, and from the very beginning, it was implemented in order to control 3 basic things: voting rights, inheritance rights, and legal rights. And that's exactly what it's doing right now. So right now, Robert and I, even though we've lived on that reservation our whole lives, because we're not enrolled, we can't vote. We cannot inherit land as an enrolled member, which is what April was talking about, which becomes a problem over multiple generations, and it's related to trust status and fee status, and the way that if you have where we are, if you have 3 generations consecutive inherit land that is not inherited by non-enrolled people, non-enrolled Indians in the federal government's terms, then what happens is when that 4th generation inherits the land, and if they're not enrolled, then that land kicks over from trust to fee status, and then you have to start paying taxes to the taxes on that land. That becomes a huge problem when you have communities like, which is what Evan was talking about earlier. It becomes a huge problem when you're talking about deeply impoverished communities who are, in many cases, you have a large percentage of your population living on some form of social assistance. How are you going to ask these people to pay taxes on land when they can't even get a job? Because there's literally no economy. So what happens then? Who in this room understands like what happens when your land, when you haven't been able to pay taxes on your land for a certain amount of time? Like what happens?
Adrian comes in.
Well, no, it's like not a hypothetical. Like what happens when you can't pay your land taxes? It like somebody else can pay your back taxes, and then they become owners of that land, right?
And who has money?
And who has money?
Not Indians.
Not Indians, right? So this is a way of undercutting your literal land base, and as Evan and Neachet were talking about earlier, you cannot have a nation without land. So there are people who will say, well, blood quantum is just that one issue. Not really. Blood quantum is literally
it's the tapestry.
In the actual meaning of the word literal, it's literally connected to every single issue you can find in Indian country. There is nothing it is not connected to, because it's about who can and can't do things, and who can inherit, who has the legal right to do these things, and who doesn't, and that's all a way of like ultimately undercutting your sovereignty, which is the whole reason that we're.
It's also important to mention that blood quantum is like cancer, and you're not gonna go up to a person and go, "You got cancer," and then just go, "Oh yeah, it's bad. Yeah, I'm gonna go do something else." And that's the way a lot of people treat blood quantum, like, "Oh, it's not good," and then that's it. And then they go off and talk about what they want to talk about, not realizing that blood quantum is literally affecting their day-to-day events on the reservation and off the reservation, which is really disgusting, because another thing about it is love. And forgive my language, but like, Sterling, how many times in your life have you heard people say, "You're dashing to marry a white woman"?
when my dad married my woman, that's how my family. Hey, that's how blood quantum works, by the way. No, when my dad, when my dad, I
I'm
know
gonna marry
that's
your
pretty-
woman next.
that's where we're at in about 20 years, right? No, when my dad married my mom, he actually had someone, a lifelong family friend, slam the door in his face and say, "You married a white woman, don't ever speak to me again." And they haven't spoken since. So like that, yeah, that's.
So you really got to think about that in terms of someone's own personal choices in life, because what blood quantum's doing, and it bothers me that no one ever talks about this. It's just the truth is that in the end, people are talking about sex and procreation, and when they tell someone, "Well, you should marry an Indian," they're really telling you, "I demand that you have sex with an Indian. I demand, you know." And I
Not
know,
just any Indian, no.
not just any Indian, an Indian in your tribe, and it doesn't even matter if they're related to you. And then, I mean, we live in a society where there's drug use, there's drug abuse, there's everybody has their own hobbies. We live in an interesting time now, and really what it becomes is I honestly do believe that blood quantum has turned into a sexual fetish. People are so concerned with who's sleeping with who. It's disgusting.
No, when I was growing up, I used to hear that story a lot, and I think it's just like people saying, "Oh yeah," I'm thinking of one guy in particular, like he has a high school girlfriend. Her parents made her stop dating him because he was not enrolled, and I used to hear that story all the time especially when I was in high school, because that's kind of when everybody's,
Figuring out who they are.
yeah, figuring out what that kind of stuff. And what's always been really interesting to me too, and I've never heard this, and probably some people will find this offensive, but some of the primary perpetuators of a belief in blood quantum are actually women, because women think about their children more than men do early on. I've never met a guy who's like, "I'm not marrying a woman who's not enrolled."
Yeah.
I've met so many Indian women who are like, "I'm not going to be with that guy, he's not enrolled," because they want their kids to be enrolled.
Almost every
So-
article written about blood in Indian country is written about a woman, and it's talking about, "I don't know if I can have a kid with a white man because I want my kid to be enrolled." But isn't that sad?
But let me finish this here, so
No.
I don't sound like I'm a misogynist. No, what I'm not saying, that's not me saying that there's something wrong with women. What I'm saying is that because of the system, and because in my experience women tend to think about kids earlier than guys do, that just ends up being how a lot of Indian women think,
Yeah.
because they're concerned about their kids, right? So it's not me saying there's something wrong with women. It's me saying women are concerned about their kids earlier than guys. And so they're thinking, well, I don't want my kid to have to deal with this shit. So I'm just going to get together with a guy who's enrolled, because that's important to me.
And also, you got to remember, blood quantum's sexist, because if an enrolled woman has a child and that child's not enrolled, that's the tribe basically going, "No, we're not going to honor you or your offspring." And then also on the vice versa with that. What if, let's say, a full-blooded Indian takes a white woman home, has children with her, or not full-blooded, let's say an enrolled Indian, and their children are enrolled as well, but their mom isn't. And this happened. This is a real case. And then that man dies. Now you have a white woman who lives on the res, who's not enrolled, who can't get any housing because you have to be enrolled to get housing, but she's raising enrolled kids. And so there's all these different facets and interesting family dilemmas that occur because of blood quantum. And again, the public Indian discourse now is to go, "Oh, blood quantum is bad," and the colonial people brought it, and then move on to the next topic. But it's like, we need to discuss this damn thing and get rid of it, because again, it's cancer. You don't just use cancer. When you have cancer, it's not a footnote. It's an ever-present thing that is damaging your life day to day. And if you ignore it, you're going to die.
Okay, I was gonna title that question, or just ask, "You're not even enrolled. How come?" How come? But
Can
Go ahead.
I have you comment on the distinction between membership and citizenship and how that impacts sovereignty?
Well, Mickey Mouse Club has members, and that's the kind of way
Country clubs have members.
country clubs have members. And to be enrolled or to be a citizen, you know, I mean, that to me, that shift in language lets you have a more deeper understanding of what these laws and treaties mean. But when you're just a member, you know, you put on your jacket, go to the club, drink wine, and get the freebies that come with it. And it's really interesting because during this topic of change in enrollment, one discussion that kept on, what was just persistent, was per cap. And our tribe, we're poor. We get $50 per cap on average a year, and it's like, is $50 that important to you? and it's real, and it gets to this point where, no, I mean, like that language is important, because if you consider yourself a member of America, you know, are you a member of the USA? No, you're a citizen. You're a stake owner. You know, not a member.
So if the end goal for tribes is full sovereignty, does that distinction have to change?
Yes.
You know,
We also can't ignore the problematic racial connotations of the concept of citizenship. I don't think we should buy into these things wholehearted, because that concept carries a lot of the problems that Sterling was citing with blood quantum, restricting inheritance, restricting land ownership, and really being a tool, at least in this country's history, of racial oppression the same way that blood quantum is for us. So I do think we need to change the way we talk about our relationship to tribal nations and tribal nations' relationship to the people they recognize as belonging to them. But I don't think that we can, say, draw a direct parallel between tribal citizenship and American citizenship, for
Why?
example. Well, because,
Expand
for
on that a little bit. I mean,
well,
because with citizenship, I mean, you can be any nationality, any race.
Now.
You can be a citizen.
Now.
in America right now.
yeah. But what about before Indians were citizens, or before freed slaves were citizens? I think that we need to.
But the global trend, isn't it, towards citizenship across the board? I mean, in France, you used to have to be French, but now you can be any nationality and apply for French citizenship.
Exactly. I just don't think we should buy into these concepts wholeheartedly with that limited perspective of this is what it means now, without acknowledging that it comes from some of these same power structures that we're trying to combat by using that word instead of another. That's all.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I mean,
I'll get the.
and I guess it's not really a question, but maybe just a comment at this point. I was listening to this, and I'm with the Navajo, full blood, and there's a reason why, and I think that maybe members of the audience, you know, might benefit or want to hear the other side of this. It is that, or at least for my Navajo perspective in the upraising, is that we were taught at a very young age. I mean, not even taught. It was just we were not interested in marrying someone outside our tribe. And if we did, it wasn't for the purpose of blood quantum. And the purpose of staying within our tribe was that you understood the language, you can talk to each other. Secondly, you had the same culture, so you could understand all of the sings, all of the songs, all of the prayers. And so we didn't see it as a blood quantum issue. And so we saw it as being within, to progress and to be within your own people. I mean, it's such a huge subject, and a lot of it I can express better in Navajo. But I just wanted to bring that side out, is that there's a reason, at least for my tribe, that we stayed within our tribe. We could talk to each other. And I think that's how it is. And certainly it isn't really like that anymore.
For my tribe, the Cheyenne, they go by descendant, so, there's so few of us that didn't mind if someone was white or, this one time during treaty negotiations, they actually said, they proposed that we get 200 white women to breed with, that'll solidify our peace, because then, we'll be one. which is, you know, a lot of, it's kind of the opposite of the, you know, but we always adopted people into the tribe, just as, like Little Big Man, that's a very common thing that we did. I mean, like, if we just have white people that were just, you know, happy to live with Indians and stuff. But anyways, he had a question.
There's a couple things. So the idea of blood quantum was something that was initiated as a formula for diminishing return, and it was a political agenda. And the truth of that is, when you look at the United States government that uses blood quantum on the 25% rule, and then look at how they apply it to the Hawaiians, where the blood quantum is 50%. Same government, you know, but they apply a different standard for the Hawaiians than they do for Indians. So what does that mean? If you cannot maintain 50% of this blood quantum, then legally, by federal law, you no longer are Hawaiian. Now, going back with Adrian had said the Cherokee, who had gotten the brunt of a lot of, you know, flack and jokes, but prior to 1970, I believe, their enrollment was about 30,000. And then they said, screw this blood quantum stuff, we're going by traditional law. And their enrollment went from 30,000 to almost 300,000. Because they followed traditional lines of family lines. And we can go back way before blood quantum with the Comanche. The Comanche, who at one time in the Low Plains were one of the most aggressive tribes there were, and so they lost a lot of male members and female members as well. And they used to run across the border into Mexico and capture Mexican women so that they could keep their numbers up. But they never once said, oh son, you know what, you're no longer gonna be Comanche because I married that Mexican woman. They never said that kind of stuff. So it's an artificial, it's a political thing that has been instigated by a government to use these kinds of controls and diminish the numbers of people. And like Evan said, citizens of a nation, the United States actually I'm one of the few people I was saying this to Evan, where the Delaware people define the United States as a nation. People don't understand that because in order to become identified as a nation, one of the criteria is you have to be able to engage in negotiations and treaties with another nation. And so the United States during the Revolutionary War were pleading with other countries to get into treaties with them, and they got into a treaty with the Delaware nation first. So the Delaware defined the United States as a nation.
I wanted to get into native land, and this is a quote I said at the last panel, but it was by Sherman Alexie. So these guys don't like this one, but he says, Sherman Alexie says, we're in a bookstore, so I assume everyone knows who he is. I am actively and publicly advocating for Native kids to leave the reservation as soon as they can. The reservation system was created by the U.S. military. It was an act of war. Why do we make them sacred now, even though most reservations are really third world horrible banana republics? So how do you answer that?
Well, first of all, I want to say that my autobiography was titled "The Toughest Indian on the World," and then he wrote that book. So, Francis, you got this?
Kind of forgot the question already. It's Sherman Alexie's awful quote, right?
Yeah.
Well, colonial context, as far as land-based use goes, and ideas of Indianness and all this, it changes from place to place and time to time. So the Navajo, they have a much larger land base than any other tribe in the United States, right?
And population.
And a good population. In Montana, you have the Blackfeet. You have my tribe, the Assiniboine Sioux, the Chippewa Cree. You have all these different peoples collected here, and a lot of them are split between the United States and Canada. So they're subject to separate colonial jurisdictions as far as to go, and one treats them this way, and the other treats them that way. So I don't know that it's good for anybody to travel and to learn and everything like that, but to learn more about the world so they can have a well-rounded worldview to know, but they need to have roots to know where they come from. And a land base itself isn't going to give you that. It doesn't matter who you are. If you don't have teachings and understandings of the world around you, the land is simply the land. I think we can see that now with the way people treat land. It's simply a place that they go. They don't really have a relationship to the yard that they have or they don't have, or the parks or anything like that. I think it just determines on what type of cultural understanding that you are presented with at an early age and how well you carry that into adulthood and how much the society in which you find yourself supports that worldview, if that makes sense. So that's why we have things like the Indian Education for All Act, is to bridge a gap, to create understanding, because I believe Denise Juneau either co-authored or authored an essay about the Indian Education for All that discusses the discombobulation that happens for an Indian child going out into a world that they themselves are not represented in at all. And when we do see ourselves, it's as mascots, you know, or being shot to death in the hundreds by John Wayne or something like that, you know. So I think reservations are important. I think the way we think about them and the way we talk about them are much more important, I guess, than the perception of maybe criminal activity.
Yeah, and I think that's just the defeatist attitude, because for myself, I work with my language, and if I left my res, my language work ends the day I leave my res. So basically, all I hear when Sherman Alexie is saying that is like, your guys' languages don't matter. Leave. Your guys' elders don't matter. Leave. It's poor. And to me, that's just an American idea of what wealth is, because when I go, you know, I'm poor, you guys, I am. My money, you know, my pockets are usually empty, but I'm rich. When I go home, I'm rich. I go down to town pump, I joke around. I got dogs following me around town. I got cousins and cousins. I hate this guy, but he's my cousin. No, I mean, but it's a really offensive quote, because, you know, I mean, like a majority of his audience is white people, and they're gonna hear that and think, oh yeah, the poor Indian, and I don't like that at all.
Why don't they just leave? You know.
Yeah.
That's what
I think it's also.
Well, it reminds me of that joke. This one old Indian, the Pope was coming to America, and he wanted to go check out the Pope. So when I saw the Pope and he went back home, he's like, so what'd you think of that Pope? He's like, oh, he's no good. And they go, well, why? Because he told us, take down your tents and get out of here.
I think one of the other problems with that quote is that it's akin. I mean, the metaphor doesn't quite work, but it's the only thing I can think of right now. It's kind of like climbing a ladder to get to the top of a building and then pretending you didn't climb a ladder to get to the top of the building. Like, the only reason Sherman Alexie has an identity is because of his reservation. You know, and I think this is really difficult for Indigenous people to grasp if they did not grow up on a reservation, because not growing up on a reservation divorces you in a very real way from that community and that whole experience of that land in particular.
Well, that becomes your identity, is not growing up on a reservation.
And it's important though that like regardless of like how you identify or how you think about yourself, your identity is always well. Although I think that's changing right now, because who was I just talking to the other day? Somebody that works with a lot of Indians that grow up off reservations, and at this point in time, they're maybe even 2 or 3 generations away from anybody that actually lived on a reservation. And in working with these kids, he said like they don't have any real sense of like belonging to a tribe or a land. They just think of themselves as Indians. Now, to me, that's the success of that's a colonial success right there. Like, if you're just an Indian and you don't even have a relationship to a land anywhere or people anywhere, then that's basically, you know, that's
George Washington
you're
smiling.
you're one step away from what those guys wanted when they were setting up the Allotment Act that April was talking about, where their entire purpose was ultimately to eliminate reservation land bases and completely assimilate Indigenous people into the larger U.S. population, and that would just be the end of what has been historically called the Indian problem. That's a phrase that used to get used a lot. It doesn't come up very much anymore, if at all. So I think it's important is that like, even if, so I used to do work that took me out to the Seattle Tacoma area a lot, and there are the largest off-reservation Blackfeet population is in the Seattle Tacoma area. There's about 5,000, and here again, here's the problem of enrollment. There's about 5,000 enrolled Blackfeet out there, but we don't actually know how many unenrolled Blackfeet are out in the Seattle Tacoma area because nobody actually tracks that.
It's important to mention
And-
that these people were relocated. They were taken off the reservation and put over here. So basically, blood quantum makes it so if I'm going to take you out of your reservation, now I put you in a whole new gene pool. So I mean, like, so it's important to mention that relocation is also works against blood quantum, and the fact that we have been relocated is another reason why we need to get rid of blood quantum, because we can't turn our backs against the people who were relocated. Sorry.
I don't remember what I was talking about now.
You
What was
talk the Tacoma area, and then
But
there's
why is-
5,000 of them, and
But
then
why was I talking about
the
this
voting.
now?
There's a big voting population there, right? And
Mm-mm.
they go the roads.
I don't remember.
Sorry.
No, it was before that.
They don't track the, they don't track that.
We don't know how many descendants.
No, I can't remember.
Sorry.
So even though so you have all those. She's got it. You have these thousands of Blackfeet that live out in the Seattle Tacoma area, and they've been out there in some cases now for like 3 generations. That moving away took largely like started in the 50s. Part of it was relocation, and part of it was actually because there was just no jobs, and so a lot of people would go out to Washington to do the kind of work that now typically Mexican immigrants do, which is they'd go out and pick fruit, and they'd go out and pick fruit during those seasons, and then go back to Browning, and then they do this, and eventually a lot of them just stayed out there because every time they went back, there were no jobs, there was no money, and so on and so forth. So, so we've got all these people, all these tribal people that have grown up away from reservations. But how is it that they refer to themselves as Blackfeet or Pikani if they know it, if they know, have a deeper sense of, how is it, what do you have to refer to? This is why we need to think about this in terms of sovereignty. If you leave the United States as a U.S. citizen, you leave the United States, you're forced to leave because Donald Trump gets what he wants, and then all the jobs, most of the jobs are gone. So somebody, you have to leave and you go to, we'll just say, you have to leave and you go to France, and while you're and you stay there because you get a job and you're getting paid and you can make a living and raise your family, and so then your kids stay there because that's where they grew up, and then and then your grandkids are there because now they're 3rd generation, people of France, of the country of France. During that time period, the United States completely disappears because I don't even know how this happens, but it happens, right? It ceases to exist. Because of Trump. We'll just keep going back to that. Because it ceases to exist as an entity, right? As a political entity that has defined like political boundaries. 3 generations down the road, if there's no U.S. land base, and I'm aware of the irony of we're talking from an indigenous perspective, talking about the U.S., but how, what do you say? Is there any way for you to say any more that in any way you are, you have any relationship to the U.S.? The U.S. doesn't exist, so you have no identity as somebody that somebody descended from the people who formerly made up that nation. If our reservation land bases cease to exist, those Blackfeet out in Seattle do not have an identity anymore. They might right now, but in 3 generations they won't. And so so even if you don't live on a reservation, your reservation is still fundamental to your identity. And that's why when I hear Sherman Alexie say something like that, I'm like, it's cool for you, bro, that you're making a good living out in Seattle, but your whole living is based off the fact that you have this specific tribal identity, and then you're saying my reservation doesn't matter, you guys should all leave. It's just total nonsense.
When I hear the Alexi quote, I think I definitely think of that as a generational perspective. My mom was born in 1946, and she had me when she was 40, so I was born in 1986, and she raised me with this idea that I should leave as soon as I could, and I did. I went to college at age 18, I moved all the way to Boston. And she also at the same time raised me to know who I was wherever I went. And I think about it, I don't have kids, I might in the future, and I think about where I would raise them, and in addition to thinking about how I grew up, my mom was one of 12, and so I grew up with lots and lots of family, and that's why I grew up knowing who I was. But to tie it back to something that was talked about in the earlier panel, if we think about the foundations of federal Indian law and the Marshall Trilogy as establishing sort of a measured separatism between us and them, where in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, he literally said that the Cherokee Nation, the border presented a bar, and the laws of the state of Georgia couldn't cross that line, right? So there's like a territorial limitation on Indian jurisdiction and tribal sovereignty there. Does that, and this is something that I think about when I think about my theoretical future as a parent, does that limit us in some way? Does that tell Indian kids who know where they are that you can't leave? And I think in the same way that Sherman's reservation is foundational to his identity and to his success, so too are the sort of struggles of that generation that grew up thinking that it was best to leave. Like, they did a lot for us. They did so much groundwork that allowed people like us to leave and come back. Now, whether or not people like us when we come back is a different story. But I think it's ultimately really important to consider both sides of that question. Who are you when you leave, and who are you when you come back, and can you come back, and then will your community respect you, and what does that mean for your status as a tribal person, citizen, member, whatever?
I have an example of that.
Yeah.
Because in Canada, the system in Canada, they're called reserves rather than reservation. That's because the term came from the British within the Royal Proclamation of 1763. A sidebar to that is, during these early periods of reservations, even in the United States, non-native people could not travel through a reservation unless they had a passport. So there's another thing. But anyhow, in Canada, the reserves are much smaller than down here. Part of the reason, and what has happened is, 50% of most populations, native populations, live off reserve. But what they then established was that if you spend, it's almost like somebody who gets citizenship or a green card in the U.S. and they're out of the U.S. for 6 months, they lose their green card. So if you live off a reserve for more than a year, I believe, you lose your status as a native person. So that question that you raised makes it very, very pertinent and scary. You know, so you have to travel back to your reserve and live there for a certain amount of time. But the land base is so small and the population has grown, it creates other problems.
Well, and if we're going to talk about evolving concepts of tribal sovereignty, and about whether or not the United States will accept an evolving concept of tribal sovereignty and how that changes that relationship, how do we do that if no one knows us but ourselves? If we never leave, if we never, if we don't have ambassadors out there, how are we ever going to be accepted as anything more modern than a group of people placed on a reservation?
So I wanted to add a perspective. So I am Bitterroot Salish, and I say Bitterroot Salish because my band came from the Bitterroot Valley as compared to coastal Salish. So when we were put on the Flathead Reservation, that was not our homeland. It was part of our Aboriginal territory, which extended from Canada to the coast to Crow Country, and down into Wyoming. So that was our Aboriginal territory. We still have place names for all of those places. And I think it goes back to what Robert was saying about the language is, our name for our people is Skebi. That means the flesh of the land. Stuli means the land. So we are flesh of the land. And no matter where I go, when I lived in Idaho, I was no less Salish than when I drove over the hill to come back to Arlee, but I couldn't vote in my tribal election because I didn't reside on the reservation. So reservations are a pretty new concept, you know, in the big scheme of things, you know. It's just 2 generations away in my family. You know, my great grandma was born in the Bitterroot. So I think all of that is related to, you know, these more modern concepts of reservation life.
Yeah, I just want to touch upon this briefly too. When he says an act of war, that's what he said. That's how they're created. But like some tribes, almost like a lot of the ones, like take the Cherokee for example, moved from to Oklahoma, so that in a sense that makes sense. But there's also my tribe that fought really hard to near extinction just to move back up north to get away from Oklahoma.
Yep.
And then that's what we tell the Southern Cheyenne. Or I told them, I don't know, they're giving me a bad time about being Northern Cheyenne. And I said, well, you guys, Southern Cheyenne, you guys were too lazy to hike back up to Langdeer. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, but we're fortunate to a lot of Montana tribes, although greatly diminished, but being our traditional homeland, at least in the area and region like that. So, but the bottom line is, the reservations are the de facto cultural centers that we always go back to, and that's our strength of base. Anyways,
Sorry, Robert kind of touched on it. We didn't explicitly say it. It's also literally only way our languages will survive is to
Yeah.
have a land base.
that was the
If
next
there is
question.
no land base, the language they're done.
How does
It just- it's
language
not.
relate to sovereignty or revitalization and such?
Could I give a tidbit there?
Yeah, he's
So,
language.
I was in Australia. I was in Australia in 1998. There was an elder there, an Aboriginal man, who people who knew him just referred to him as Uncle Eric.
Uncle Eric?
Yeah, Uncle Eric. He was in his late 70s, and he was really troubled about something. And I could see it was really troubled. And he said, I went over to him and said, Uncle Eric, what's wrong? He said, I've been called into the court. And I said, well, why? And he said, I have to prove that we've been here for time immemorial. And I just started laughing. And I said, well, that's easy. And he looked at me and said, well, how do I do it? I said, you go into the court, you refuse to speak English, you speak your language. They will have to travel everywhere to find out somebody who can translate for you, and the only place they can find that is in your territory. That proves that you've been there time immemorial. They can't go to India, they can't go to China. They have to find someone to translate for you at your land base. That proves it right there.
Yeah, and what's interesting actually is the individual me and Sterling here work with our language revitalization work, William Bigbull. I asked him, how do you say sovereignty in Blackfoot? And he started thinking. Instantly I said, isn't it Amish Che West? No. It's a dirty word. But, no, but he said, Kitoksin, and that just means our territory. So our land is our sovereignty, right? And then he even started talking about the Nitoyas, the teepee, and how that's our sovereignty, and the architecture involved. So it is really important that we preserve our languages, and also too, I mean, like everybody's all worried about blood and skin color, but I mean, like, and I don't mean to sound corny, but I mean, like, can you imagine if we were all blind? We would all see each other like more clearly, we wouldn't be molested by this idea of race. But that's the thing, is that it's the words that we choose that dictate or create who we are. And if we don't have a language to support our sovereignty, it just makes sovereignty. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying it's a lot harder. But again, I mean, like when you speak your language, no one can deny you who you are. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white on both sides of the spectrum. If you speak that language, no one can deny you who you are. And it really annoys me because, I mean, like, this idea of race is killing our languages as well. He was like, well, I got a card in my pocket that says I'm Indian, so I don't need to learn my language. There's another reason why it dies. And then another, but I mean, like, really, also, too, is just our own decisions. But again, sorry to ramble, but I have a lot of empathy for people who just don't have the opportunity to learn their languages. That's important to talk about, too. So, you know, I dedicate my life to researching under Neachet here, particular methodologies on how to teach languages effectively. And it's a healing process. So really, I mean, like, really, I guess what I'm trying to say is that through our languages, we will heal and rehabilitate. And that's how in my mind, in my opinion, in my experience, is that's how we regain sovereignty, is rehabilitation. Because sovereignty to us isn't something that's in the future. Sovereignty to us is something that stretches to the past. And then it was just fractured in ways by the colonial force. And rather than gaining sovereignty, we need to regain sovereignty. And I really think that's important to mention. And I do really think that language, not think. Obviously, we have a story here that lets you know that language is a big part of sovereignty. I mean, like, what language did English borrow from for their law? They borrowed from Latin and France, right? So language has a big influence in sovereignty.
I think too that it's really important to this is kind of it's been one of the recurring threads all day, and it's relative to what April was saying about, like, you know, we probably shouldn't just accept like these ideas of citizenship, you know, without question. It's something that you guys talked about this morning with, like, well, you know, as long as we're in we're in American court, we're in American court, we're in a U.S. court. We're not in like a legitimate Blackfeet court. Like, we don't even know what that really looks like, to be honest. And in a number of ways, right? But like, we don't know because the court system that's in place basically mirrors, you know, the U.S. court system. And so, like, what does that mean for us in terms of, like, sovereignty and like, we're so because at this point in time, especially starting with, like, I don't know, for most tribes, especially smaller ones, like, once you get to people who are in their 50s right now and below, most of us are not fluent speakers, and so we're accustomed to
all of them are not fluent speakers.
Well, you can't say that about some tribes, though. I mean,
Okay,
like,
you're
like there's
Sorry,
like,
I thought you were just talking about us.
Oh, well, us, yeah, us for sure.
I only think about us.
But but we're so accustomed to thinking about this situation in terms through the English language. We're looking at it through the English language that we forget that, like, well, you know, and then we do these exercises, and everybody from Indian country has done this, and we do it so often that we never even really talk about it, which is, like, all of us spend a certain amount of our lives imagining what was it like at this point in time. What was it like in 1850? What was it like in 1910? And so one of the things that I've thought about a lot, that I've always, like, that I always thought that like treaty negotiations and gatherings would have been an incredibly interesting moment. And one of the things that because we're so accustomed to thinking of ourselves being inside the United States, as well as particularly as Blackfoot people, that we start to forget that, like, at the 1855 treaty, all the we didn't have anybody present at that one, but all the treaty negotiations we had, where we had representatives after that, there were also representatives from all the northern Blackfoot groups there too, but they were not recorded in the treaty negotiations because the United States did not consider them to be, because they were in Canada, right? But for us, we were all together. And so one of the things that the guy that Robert and I work with talks about all the time is, like, there were people who were Kaena, Siksika, and Apatoxipikani at those negotiations, but they're not in the records, and they were not allowed to sign the treaties, right? And this strikes me as, like, a really, like, I mean, it seems really simple, and maybe, like, more simple than it is at first, but at some point a couple months ago, I was like, I've never heard anybody say, okay, so at those treaty negotiations, how were the Blackfoot people who were there talking in Blackfoot about those negotiations? They weren't calling them treaties. So they clearly have, I mean, and they weren't like not using language to describe,
Yeah.
like to talk to each other about what was going on. So what were they saying?
Inyokakshchimax, and
Ah.
it means long time
Estu.
agreement.
Estu.
Oh,
Yeah,
Eschokakshchimax.
Estu Kakshchiman. That's it's the DC is Binapa Kakshchiman. But so like we have the term, which I've never heard any Blackfoot person use. I know that there are people out there who know it, but it's not like we just call them treaties. But in our language, they're Eschukakshchiman, and it means long time agreement, right? Every single tribe has a term for treaty in their own language. Like, I seriously think everybody who's interested in this question of sovereignty needs to go figure out what your term for that negotiation moment is in your language. Because that's a starting point to say, well, you may have called them this, but this is what we called them, this is how we thought about them, and you have to acknowledge that perspective. Regardless of what you have to say about it, this is how we think about it. And the starting point is that term in your language. It's not calling it a treaty. And that strikes me as like a really, really important thing that I've never heard anybody talk about. And I think that's something that needs to be, you have to find, like when we're talking about sovereignty, this is something that Neachet was talking about earlier this morning, we have to find some way to stand on our own ground instead of constantly allowing ourselves to be drawn into the other context. Instead of only thinking of it in terms of the US context, we have to find some way to start saying, no, this is where it starts for us. And like the language, to me, is the primary starting point of saying, no, this is our term. This may be how you understand it, but this is how we understand it, right?
Okay, it says Standing Rock here, so I better think of a question. In a piece you wrote, Sterling, it said you went to Standing Rock, as did these other two, Francis and April.
April didn't go.
April didn't go. Oh, Francis did.
But go ahead and,
But yeah,
she's
anyways.
in it, so she'll just take credit for it.
Yep. I was there first.
She was actually there before it started.
Yeah.
I was there when it was called Sitting Rock.
But yeah, he said, he noticed one of the absent of discussion was the issues of sovereignty. People. So when you went there, there's no one discussing sovereignty. Why is it important that they should?
Well, I mean, it was a really interesting experience for me because I incidentally, this is one of the reasons that I can sit here and talk with some degree of authority, even though I don't have any, about this stuff, is that because I was in the Native Studies department here at UM. Francis is in that department. Robert has been through that department. April, I don't know if you, no, she's too good for that. No, she's one of those Indians who's always acting too good, and so she doesn't do what the rest of us do.
That's what's going on.
So, but it's like one of the subtexts of this conversation in this panel today is that Native Studies department over there. I can't stress to you guys how important that thing is, because how many true Native Studies departments in the U.S. are there? Like 4?
It's
Maybe.
It's less than half a dozen.
Yeah, I mean, like, so.
Half a
I'm
baker's
gonna
dozen?
translate that from Arapaho. That's less than 6. but
Less than half of 12.
Oh, I mean, that's what I mean. Yeah. So, God damn it. So what? Like part of the reason I could go to Standing Rock and be thinking of this as an issue of sovereignty is because I took Native Studies courses over here and got this education in both history and, to a degree, into I didn't really get an education in sovereignty. I got an education in the history of like the limitation of our sovereignty. But in terms of like trying to understand like, well, what does sovereignty in action look like that was one of the reasons I felt the need to go over there, because to me, even though a lot of people didn't see it that way, who were actually involved much more deeply in it than I was, to me that was a really, really serious like moment where we had both collectively and the Standing Rock tribe individually had an opportunity to leverage that moment specifically as a moment of sovereign action. Now, whether or not that happened, I don't think it really did, but it kind of did, and also mostly didn't. And so, I wanted to see what that looked like. So I go over there, and what I found out while I was there, and this was in mid-September, was that no one, if like I said, if that Montana Quarterly was still over there, I could say, you guys need to go buy that so you can read my article. That's the only reason I'm on this panel, is to promote myself. What I found out was that the issue of sovereignty, or like framing that Standing Rock as an issue of sovereignty, was not something that was occurring like in a widespread way in that camp. It is not how it was being, at least initially, it was not being presented that way to the U.S. media. It was presented as a water issue, as a human rights issue, as an environmental issue, but at no point in time was the primary push that of like saying this is an issue involving specifically like Standing Rock Sioux, but also in the largest sense, like I've never been able to figure out like we have a term Nitsitapi that generally refers to all the Blackfoot people together. I've never, I heard that maybe Ocheri Shakonwi is a term that I don't like to use the term Sioux because it's not, it's an English term, and if we're talking
French,
about sovereignty, it's actually a French bastardization of an Ojibwe term.
Oh, wow.
But
It means enemy.
yeah, but if we're going to talk about it in terms of sovereignty, the only way to make that that meant that issue was primarily an issue for Standing Rock and the larger Sioux people. It was not a Blackfeet issue, except in the sense that by helping them defend their sovereignty, I and anybody else was also simultaneously defending Blackfoot sovereignty, because the way the one thing that connects all the tribes in the U.S. is the fact that we're all under the umbrella of federal Indian law. And they're the ones who have abrogated our treaties. They're the ones who have limited our sovereignty. And so in that sense, ironically, like the one truly pan-Indian thing that I accept is that we're all pan-Indian, because we're pan-Indian in the sense of we're all under the same laws that are limiting us. And so I was seeing it in that way, but I did not see any, that was not a common narrative. Like that was not what I heard people at Standing Rock talking about. They were really talking about the other things, the environmental issues, the human rights issues, the state police violations of people's various rights. But to me, the starting point was that the entire first third to nearly half of the Dakota Access Pipeline runs through unceded, stolen treaty land. There is no way around that. Like you cannot argue it. You can say, well, I don't like that, but you can't argue it. And all you have to do is look at the map that was in that Montana Quarterly that, and it shows the route of the pipeline runs through land that was taken. Do you remember what the date was? When was it? When that all that unceded land that was? It wasn't 1871. It was, or no, it was 1871. Anyway, all that land is stolen. All that land was taken by the United States government without, and it was actually taken essentially when North and South Dakota were created as states. They basically just created the states and just erased this unceded treaty land and said, oh, this is now part of North Dakota. Oh, this is now South Dakota. And there were no negotiations for that. And so from a tribal perspective, from a sovereignty-oriented perspective, for me, that's all stolen land. There's no way around it. And so that pipeline was not just running just where the drill pad that they were talking about, right? It wasn't just that point. It was also the entire first, almost half of the pipeline was the same as that drill pad. It was all running through treaty land that had never been ceded. And that's a pretty, like, you have to imagine, like, at some point, like, I don't know, China just deciding that, like, the Pacific Northwest belonged to China, taking it, and then at some point, and and then there's like a Washington reservation for non-Indians, and then they run a pipeline through there, and then the people on that new reservation are only arguing about one corner of it and saying you have to argue about the whole thing, the entire, that's your starting point to me. And it just unfortunately it was never really framed that way, because the kind of knowledge necessary to, and information necessary to understand it from that point of view is just not readily available. And so it got the message from the tribal point of view got really, really muddled to me. And I heard a lot of different messages, but there was no unifying message. And to me, the only thing that could unify all those issues was the issue of sovereignty.
How about you, Francis?
Oh.
We're done. No, we're done now. We're done.
Okay. Well, I want to read something here. It's from the Tehitan Indians versus United States, and it's from the Supreme Court opinion. The line of cases adjudicating Indian rights on American soil leads to the conclusion that Indian occupancy, not specifically recognized as ownership by action authorized by Congress, may be extinguished by the government without compensation. Every American schoolboy knows that the savage tribes of this continent were deprived of their ancestral ranges by force, and that even when the Indians ceded millions of acres by treaty in return for blankets, food, and trinkets, it was not a sale, but the conqueror's will that deprived them of their land. That's a Supreme Court case. I think it would be pretty ridiculous if we cited some cases, or like Dred v. Scott or something, some really racially motivated thing. But it's totally cool when we talk about Indians that we say that savages. In a Supreme Court case, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But it's, in any event, so that's like the idea behind Indian rights and Indian land rights is based around the idea of our race or supposed race stereotypes. And you go back to the Cherokee, the Cherokee decision is actually the first case in Indian law, didn't have any Indian parties to it. So it was two non-Indians talking about land that was purchased from the tribe, or so there's no Indian plaintiff there, defendant, and the Johnson v. McIntosh is the case, and they
Well, Fletcher versus Peck preceded McIntosh.
True. Yeah. Okay. So, with Johnson v. McIntosh, they go on. Marshall goes on to say that we have no title to the land because we were discovered. The doctrine discovered. We talked about that earlier, and I think that is often completely. I think it's underestimated for the value of that. For the very idea that we have a town here right now because of that. You can go back. I went to the territorial papers and stuff, and you can read the petition to the state government, the territorial government, to have the Salish removed from this area. And there was like 2 Sioux Indians in the area, and they said remove them too. Like they just wanted everybody gone, all the Indians
I'm
gone.
fine with that.
And it's ridiculous that these kinds of arguments are allowed to stand because of this racial motivation. And then we go back to the land and the sovereignty issue, and then Standing Rock, and then we come down to like what I really think is interesting, the idea of sovereignty. And let's be honest, not all Indian tribes are capable of sovereignty. They're not. They can't function economies. We were just talking about that. They couldn't regulate a traffic light or to adjudicate people who run a red light. They wouldn't be able to do that. They just don't have the infrastructure that's necessary for that. And that's where self-determination comes in, which is different. A similar idea, but just saying, let's build your way to being a sovereign nation. And I would say that I would want to know how many Indian tribes actually want to be sovereign nations, and how many of them want to take part in that enterprise. It's extremely difficult. And if you're doing it in a colonial context, everything we've said here today is under the umbrella of white supremacy and Eurocentrism. That's where we're sitting at with this, is that I think it was only recently that I was able to conceptualize indigenous issues outside of the context of race, and to do that, anytime you talk about it, you sound like a complete radical, like you're crazy,
I want to add because the case that you talked about is, I think, in the 1800s, but in 1993, it's an Missouri case in British Columbia, Supreme Court, McGecker, he stated in his opinion about the Nishka. So the Nishka were people who, when the settlers got there, they owned everything, not the settlers, but the Nishka. So the white settlers had to pay a fee back to the Nishka if they wanted to fish in a tributary, if they wanted to hunt on a mountain, because they owned everything. And so they codified all of this into books for this one case, the Gitsan Wet'suwet'en. And Judge McGecker decided that, in his opinion, he said, at best these people were short, nasty, and brutish, and were so low on the scale of civilization they have no rights. This is in 1993, and he chose to not listen to any of the expert witnesses for the Gitsan Wet'suwet'en, saying that they are too close to their subjects to be objective. But he accepted everybody else's opinion for the province as if they would never be biased. So this is happening in 1993.
I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but I want to talk a little bit about Teton and the difference there between, so that's an Alaska case from 1955, and I want to talk a little bit about the difference between that and what's happening at Standing Rock, especially under the reserved rights doctrine and treaty rights. So Teton involved whether or not Aboriginal title in Alaska was compensable under the Fifth Amendment Takings Clause, and the Supreme Court said it wasn't. And Francis just read you the language from that. And I think, number one, we should keep in mind, Sterling said earlier that what we all have in common is that we're all subject to this body of federal Indian law. So all that language about every schoolboy knows, what's really interesting about that is we bought Alaska from Russia. We never conquered Alaska, right? So to apply that rationale specifically in that case is inherently racist. But second, as contrasted to Aboriginal title, the land Sterling's talking about at Standing Rock was reserved by this 1851 treaty. And under sort of Winans in a line of cases called the reserved rights doctrine, that says that treaty rights are reserved rights by the tribes. The United States doesn't grant tribes treaty rights, right? The federal sovereign isn't giving tribes things in treaties. Tribes are reserving some things and trading away others. So I know that we're not in an Indian law class here, but I want to make sure that we distinguish Aboriginal title from the reserved rights doctrine and from treaty rights, and also to sort of use that to emphasize what Sterling said about how you can't deny that this land was reserved under the 1851 treaty, even if that was subsequently ignored in the development of that area.
Oh.
Also,
It's the only time she's ever tried to back me up on anything.
It is.
Usually she's trying to cut me down. And
well, she supported your shirt.
This is a sovereign shirt, man.
That's how you get sovereignty. I just also want to talk about rhetoric too, and rhetoric is really important because, again, the words we use, obviously words motivate people more than most things, and just like this previous election, rhetoric is what won the election, and in a way too, I would almost say that in a way our rhetoric is failing white America to teach them. And I might be hated for saying this by a lot of Indians, but I'm going to because I hate other. No. Let's just be truthful. White people colonization didn't work out for white people. It didn't. Who's the most? What population in America is the most poor? White. I mean, I'm not trying to say this to to erase what colonization did to us. I mean, I live that reality every damn day in my life. But still, I think it's really important to also have that empathy and reach out that arm of understanding and going hey, colonization didn't work out for all white people. So when we talk about these ideas of colonization, we're not blaming white America as much as we're blaming that white supremacist doctrine and that that Eurocentric mindset. It's a mindset we're attacking and not the population. And I just think that's really important because throughout the course of of American history. You see it even with Jefferson, with the white suffrage movement, where it seems as if poor white people have been pawns to rich white people, or just rich people in general. Doesn't, I mean, like, you know, once you get $1 billion, you know, the only color that really matters is green. You know, it's, you know, white's all right, but green is, you know, but you know, but I really think that's important because after the election, me, this guy, and this guy were at a bar in Billings, and it was right about when that one song came out. What song was it? Bob Seger or what? I don't know. It might have even just been.
Bob Seger hasn't released a song in about 25 years.
But it was a karaoke bar. Remember? And what song? It's really important. This song. It might have been Funky Town. But anyway. No. No, but I'm just messing. No, but that's when it hit me. I was looking around, and I felt this type of anger in this, you know, in white America, in this bar, but I knew that anger wasn't directed towards me. Right? Anger was this type of angst where, for the past whatever years, the American dream was not working out for these people who were told that colonization is going to work for you for generations and generations. People were promised this riches. And of course, you know, over on the reservation, everything was taken away from us. That's no joke. But still, you know, I really do believe that in order for us to like get rid of like the 1% or whatever we want to call it, that we need to acknowledge that colonization didn't work out for 99.9% of the human beings, because colonization, yes, racism is a tool within colonization, but racism isn't colonization. Colonization is perpetual. It never ends. It keeps on going and going and going. And as long as you have a population that will fit in with that rhetoric and that, you know, that goal, you keep all the riches while all these other people are suffering for you. And a lot of time it is white people. And it really sucks that we live in an era where it's almost as if like you have this idea that liberals versus white America almost, right? And that just sucks, because that's not what we want. Because it's like, hey man, you're poor, I'm poor. We understand each other on a poor level. You know?
We understand each other poorly.
Yeah. And really what it is that like we need to talk about all the gradients of oppression, because economic oppression is real, but it is different than racial oppression. And white America needs two things about white America. Number one, they need to recognize that economic oppression is different than racial oppression. But number two, they also deserve to be told, hey man, here's a helping hand. I recognize that you've been oppressed. Because who elected Trump? Oppressed white people. You know?
My one consolation about Trump being elected is that now, and this is no comment on you as an individual, but that like now the rest of it, now all of America gets to know what it's like to be under a tribal council, where like nothing is worth, nothing is.
They're like, oh, he hired his daughter. Oh, yeah.
It's like, well, think about it from this perspective. Think about it like this: he's hiring his relatives. He's dismissing highly qualified people to hire his unqualified relatives. He's hiring.
He's not doing his job.
He's hiring other people. Other people that are. They're strictly in it to benefit themselves and their families, and he's lying all the time, and
he's always going to his own property.
Yeah, he spends. I mean, seriously, like, you guys think Trump's crazy? It's like, that's my whole life. Like, that is what the Blackfeet Tribal Council has been like my entire life.
There's a saying. They say, Bill Clinton was the first black president. Trump is the first Blackfeet president. So. No, but also too though, I think you know, not to get corny, but to be corny. I really do believe that like one of the biggest factors is when you have panels about racism or oppression, that you need to have laughter involved, because when everybody's laughing, you're at an equal stance, right? So, good job.
Are you guys going to talk about blood quantum?
What is the,
So,
how come you're not even enrolled? Yeah, I was gonna open up the questions, but first, is there someone from Bozeman? There was someone from Bozeman that I want to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day.
Robert drove him off.
I'll talk about Indigenous Peoples Day. For me, it's every day.
Go ahead.
I just want you to clarify, with blood quantum as an issue with many aspects, is it so that between people, they are defining themselves differently, connecting to each other differently?
Absolutely.
And so that's eroding the culture.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
it
think
is.
I could say, I moved here to Missoula when I was 10 years old, and I didn't know I was an Indian until I moved to Missoula. Because at a time before that, I was just a person, I was just a human being
Yeah.
who existed in a cultural context that I understood and knew. And I came out here, and I was the only dark-skinned, mildly dark-skinned person in a group of like 500 students, you know. So I had no idea until people were asking me if I lived in a teepee, if that I was an Indian. Like, I know what a teepee is. Yeah, I've been in one. I don't live in one. Why would I live in a teepee?
Yeah, but did you though?
There's a trailer.
It was the modern teepee.
Well, it's a hut house. So.
And that also
Hobbit hole.
with your parents, some would consider that or call that a biracial marriage. And were you exposed to different cultural traditions with that?
Well, I mean, I like this is the problem with racial rhetoric is that it really reduces people's experience to like this sort of really vague kind of like idea. Like my mom's family has been on the reservation since
42?
He's this guy. No, it was later than that. I know that's how you know he's a young elder. He knows more about my family than I do. It's right after World War II. So my mom and her siblings all have spent their entire life on the reservation. Now that's a complicated experience. I mean, I could talk for a long time about it, and I will. No, I won't. But
Make a long story even longer.
But I know how much time do you have? So I don't know. Here's the thing that like my mom and dad don't think about it that way. So that doesn't mean that there aren't complications from the differences, but there's no. It's not like I didn't grow up like. What fucked me up more than having a non-Indian and an Indian parent was blood quantum. Because I grew up with the idea that I was only part something, you know? And then later on I realized that this idea of like being a fraction of something was really literally an idea. There is no physical reality to it. I don't know if we were clear, like there is no, like blood quantum is a colonial fiction. It does not exist.
I mean, just
There-
read
it
Harry
just-
Potter.
It's some literally invented. You just have to go do the research, but nobody does it, of course. It's so. In fact, what is that guy's name? That Paul somebody. He wrote a really good paper on. No, never mind. That's the last time I look over there to answer for help. No,
McCartney?
So I don't know how to answer because the second that I've never thought of, I don't like it like the term biracial. Just I don't know. It's because I grew up on a reservation though. You see that that's like the like I'm gonna use salient, you know, like the salient like the one salient fact of my life that is that I grew up on a reservation, and so I had a very different experience of my identity than I would have if I had not grown up on a reservation with the same parents. Because I grew up with, I don't want to spend much of the panel talking about this, to be honest, because I understand it's interesting, but it's also like, let me reframe this. Okay, so if the second that I start thinking about myself as, here's why I think this conversation is so interesting to non-Indians who are U.S. citizens, and why it's so hard for non-Indians to understand how that conversation is damaging to tribal sovereignty. Because it's easy for a US citizen to say, well, I'm this and I'm that and I'm that and I'm that. But you're still a US citizen. You're still 100% a US citizen. The second I start talking and thinking about myself as a bisected person, as a fractionated person, that's also simultaneously the moment I lose my citizenship. Because my citizenship is directly tied, and lack thereof, is directly tied to the idea that I'm part this and part that. So like you can say, you have various ancestries, whatever they are, but you can still vote. The second I acknowledge that as like my the primary reality of my identity, I'm also accepting the fact that because I'm this and that, I'm not allowed to vote.
Yes, and is there a way or a movement toward fighting the injustice of that?
Well, we tried, and it was we tried enrollment reform in 2012, and it didn't go through.
But
And
can it?
well, I mean, you can keep trying and you can keep trying, but the thing is that it's incredibly difficult because because I had to go to school to figure this stuff out. You see, I had to read books, I had to do my own research. Nobody taught me this because this is not readily available information. Where do you find the stuff that we said about blood quantum today, right?
But for the people who now do know it, how can that knowledge?
You know what they do? They tell me to shut up because they don't want to hear it.
Really?
Yes, because it would be like it's like me telling you that you've been underwater your whole life and you saying, "Fuck no, I haven't," because you don't know it, but I do.
Well, what it is, it's like a bunch of Islam people telling the hardcore alt-right that they're not violent people, and they already made their decision. They're violent people. They made that decision, but they're not violent people. So what you're dealing with is you're just dealing with colonization, and part of colonization is to make people dumb.
One thing real quick. The reason that I don't want to frame myself in that as a fractionated person is because we're not sovereign. If we were fully sovereign, I would be far more comfortable having like a broad-ranging discussion about like, oh, these are the various, because I can do that. I've like done a lot of, this is like self-examination, but the thing is that the second I start having that conversation, if you don't understand that the most concerning thing for me is my lack of voting rights because of this legal. See, you're not legally bound to the idea that you're part this and part that. I am.
Nobody in America is except for Indians.
And because of that, I have to start with no. I understand all that. That's all interesting, but it's more important for me to make sure that non-Indians understand that where I'm coming from is that I want to vote.
Right.
And I refuse, like personally, I reject fundamentally the idea that I'm a fractionated human being. And if we can get to a point where I don't have to legally think about that way anymore, then I'm far more likely to have a conversation in public about the different things that make up my identity. Because your identity is not, like, you can argue this in different ways, but your identity is not legally politicized. Mine is. So the second I start talking about my identity, I'm accepting the terms of the colonial contract. Like the colonizer has said, this is what your identity is. And the second I agree to that, the second I talk about myself in that way, I'm shaking hands with that colonial policy. And I refuse to do that. So I'm not like saying that, like, I'm not trying to be an asshole, you know, but it's a really, like, I'm really hesitant to talk about like this whole idea of being this and that in this context, because it's far more important for me to say I need to vote. You know, I need to be able to vote, because right now we have 12 or 13,000 people on our reservation, and we have somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 of those people that are like me and Robert. So we're black people, we're not enrolled, so we can't vote. Now imagine having 30% of the state of Montana is under Montana law, but cannot vote.
Right, it's hard.
Like it's really, it just
also
destroys.
interject in there is that with that conversation comes even more racial stupidity, because like I said earlier, both of my parents are enrolled Blackfeet tribal members. I'm not. So within this conversation of enrollment, there was a faction of people who were against enrollment reform that started going, okay, well, everybody who has two parents that are Blackfoot enrolled should be enrolled. And then the discussion went that direction. I did not like that one bit because I don't see myself as more deserving of Blackfoot than, well, no, actually not. I am more Blackfoot but more like than another person because it's just, that's racial thinking. And basically, again, race is a fiction. To call someone biracial, you might as well call them a mudblood or, you know, half hobbit and
Well,
half
that's what I was
elf.
asking if that term.
Yeah, oh, it
is
comes
used.
up.
But
But
you, and now you're mentioning 3,000 to 4,000 people, that's a
Yeah.
lot of people to.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
a
To
massive
be
number.
able to hopefully have some input and influence.
But it doesn't work that way because here's how it works. If I try to stand up and speak, especially after that enrollment reform movement that in a certain way failed and in another way it was successful in the sense that for the first time ever, it got a lot of people in the community openly talking about it, which had never happened before. And so there was a lot of like, you know, sometimes even threats of physical violence. But
yeah.
I know.
Pretty
But
sure
what
me and
happens
this guy
though?
got death threats.
And
this guy,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
all got death threats.
Yeah, but the problem is that the second somebody like me or Robert, because also in case you can't tell, we have very strong opinions, right? So like I'm not sure if that's come across to anybody here today, but the if I stand up and I say this is why I think the water compact should be passed, anybody that disagrees with me, all they have to do is say you're not enrolled, you have no right to speak about this, and then my opinion is erased, right? But they'd be happy to use my opinion if they agree with me. Do you see? So it removes people like me from the political arena completely. It delegitimizes my opinions in a legal sense, and that's, you just have to think, just imagine for yourself what that does to a community when you have you have a caste system is what you have.
Yeah, we do, and the gradients of caste is actually it's difficult to talk about because there's more than just the unenrolled and there's non-enrolled, because if you're above a half and your blood quantum is at a quarter and you're above half, then you have every right to have a family with whomever you want.
Right.
And your kids will be enrolled. But if you're below a half, above a quarter, you need to find someone who has the complementary blood quantum so your children will be enrolled. So, and it goes back to what I was talking earlier, the freedom to have a family with whomever you want is ripped away from you. And again, if you're a full blood, you know, I mean, we had an individual here say that they're full blood, and to me that's really weird because we have tens of thousands of years of human history. We cannot claim full blood, anybody. But anyways, a full blood has 2 generations. Their grandchildren will be enrolled. There's the top of the caste system, and then there's the people right below full blood to right above a half. There's people right below a half to right below above a quarter, and then there's the people who are below a quarter on down. The caste system is wild, and we don't talk about it because, when you talk about a caste system, you think about a third world country, but then on the same token, people turn around, oh, Indians are third world countries. Even Indians do that, and it bothers me because we're not. I mean, every house in Browning has satellite, man. And then not only that, I mean, like, yeah, we are poor, but we're lavishly poor.
I was going to say, I was talking about the genocide thing earlier. I don't know how many tribes in the United States are subject or have been subjected to genocide. I think if we look at federal Indian law, there's a way that we could probably apply it to probably every tribe. But if you look at the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the gentleman who wrote it, I think Raphael Lemkin, used like the United States, not just the United States, but North and South America as templates for genocide, and understanding how it works. And the United States has met all of the points for genocide. There's like 5 criteria that the U.S. has to meet. It's not just killing people, and it can be done in a time of peace or a time of war. And it's the intent is one of the things that they say was to destroy a group in whole or in part. One of them is like the physical destruction of the group, the prevention of births within the group, the forcible removal of children from the group, the outright killing, and there's another one I can't think of right now. But anyway, I think if we look at it right now, you can clearly see that like the policies of the U.S., if you're familiar with some of them, they line up pretty good with that. And when you go to like the Indian tribes and like my tribe, for instance, they have sovereign immunity. We can't do anything. I can't do anything. Plus, I'm only allowed to be adjudicated in the court. I couldn't like sue the tribe because they have sovereign immunity, you know. And if I were to go and petition a claim that said that I want my rights enforced, we don't even have a Bill of Rights to enforce.
Yep.
You know, let alone a way for somebody who's subject to those laws to file grievance in any way. They wouldn't have to hear it. It would just be would they like to hear it? You know, I can't vote. The same thing that Sterling was saying.
We can't protest.
Yeah.
I mean, we could, but if the tribe says no, then they could literally kick us off the land.
Yeah. Then there's no recourse for that for people like me exactly. And again, my dad's like on the council, right? Call my dad up and he'd be like, "You got yourself into that mess, man. I'm not dragging you out of it," which makes sense. He's on council, but yeah. So we
Man,
can't.
there's so much in that statement.
Yeah.
Like, he's on council.
But I was thinking of things like we have the general council back home where you can file a petition to have a general council, which means everybody. So this is like the government here, but there's a general council that can be convened where everybody can have a say. It's like a referendum, and you can't even file that paperwork unless you're enrolled. You know, you can't do any of that stuff unless you're enrolled. And who's responsible for my enrollment are people who are fully enrolled, whose best interest is served by me not being
Yep.
enrolled, right?
Well,
And we have the same thing.
who think their best interest.
And then
Individual best.
Yeah.
and then there's
To
even
get them reelected.
the Indian Child Welfare Act even has some interesting blowbacks with that, because if you say you are Indian and you grew up on a res, and this is actually a real life situation. A young lady who is Salish but she's not enrolled had a child with somebody who was enrolled up in Belknap. That individual left her with the child to raise since he was 6. So this individual, the father, enrolled that child in his own tribe and was able to take him away because of ICWA. So, and then another thing about that is Angelina Jolie can't adopt an Indian, and that's wrong. Okay.
Well, actually, wait, because there's something that tails onto that's really important that very few people are aware of. In Ohio, there was a woman who, this is back in the 80s, she had fostered an absentee Shawnee girl, and she wanted to adopt the girl. And so it went to the Indian Child Welfare Act, where they had to find her relatives to give them the right to take their child for cultural continuity. So this woman got highly offended, and she contacted her representative, and they attached a rider to a bill. And I was in Washington when this happened. They attached the rider to a bill to get around the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the rider said that basically after 1995, any child born on a reservation could no longer be enrolled. It's retroactive, it's legislative genocide. And the bill passed in the House of Representatives. There was one person who was arguing it, and that was the representative from Samoa. And it passed. It passed, and the thing is, because it passed without any real objection, it went to the House Senate, and it would have just gone through there. It took presidential intervention, who was Clinton at the time, to stop it. But had he not done that, there would be children today who would no longer be enrolled. And so that meant when the last enrolled person died, Indian tribes wouldn't exist anymore.
We're short on time here. But I just wanted to close with a quote by a friend of ours. A lot of us know him, Shan Ray. He's a white guy who grew up on my res. His books are over there, American Copper. But he was talking about American Copper, and like the Sand Creek and massacre he mentioned in there, and why it's important that people need to read that. But he says, with a dominant white culture in the history of America, we have such colonial amnesia. We need to keep it to the forefront of our heart and mind if we're ever going to be able to move on to the next level of humanness. Anyway, I guess guess, we conclude?
Wait, we can't conclude until somebody gets into a fight.
Oh,
I was just gonna do that.
you'll have to.
Like
respond.
Francis just suggested we take this meeting to the street.
Let's go then.
It's not a real Blackfeet meeting until somebody threatens somebody else's life.
So we'll just.
So I want to ask a question. Who are Indians?
Oh, wait, but I need to say something else though.